Nobody breathes when Daniel Mercer walks through the ER. That was the first thing Claire Whitmore heard on her first morning at St. Vincent Memorial Hospital. The words came from a nervous intern clutching a coffee cup with both hands like it might stop the shaking. Around him, nurses moved faster than normal. Monitors beeped in sharp, uneven rhythms. Rubber saws squeaked across polished floors under cold white lights. Every conversation dropped the second the elevator at the end of the hallway opened. Daniel Mercer stepped out wearing a charcoal suit beneath a dark overcoat, silver hair perfectly combed back, eyes colder than the January rain hitting the hospital windows outside. He didn't greet anyone. Didn't smile. He simply walked through the emergency department while department heads followed behind him like terrified shadows. A young nurse accidentally bumped a supply cart into the wall beside Trauma Bay 3. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Mercer stopped instantly. The entire hallway froze. "Name," he said quietly. The nurse swallowed hard. "Emily, sir." Mercer stared at the fallen clipboard near her feet. "Clean out your locker before noon." No yelling. No anger. Somehow that made it worse. Emily's eyes filled immediately while the others avoided looking at her. Mercer continued walking as if nothing had happened. Claire watched silently from the medication station. She had arrived 30 minutes early that morning. Her navy scrubs looked perfectly pressed. Brown hair tied back neatly. Calm eyes scanning every hallway, every monitor, every tray of emergency supplies with strange precision. She had already reorganized 2 crash carts because oxygen masks were stored incorrectly. Nobody noticed except an older janitor pushing a mop bucket down the corridor. "First day?" he asked softly. Claire nodded once. "You picked a rough place to start." Before she could answer, alarms suddenly chirped from room 12. A patient's blood pressure dropped sharply. Several nurses rushed in at once while a resident barked orders louder than necessary. Claire stayed where she was, listening instead of moving. Her eyes shifted toward the monitor mounted above the doorway. Pulse unstable. Oxygen falling. She quietly reached beside her and grabbed a portable airway kit before anyone requested it. Seconds later the resident inside yelled, "I need respiratory support now." Claire entered calmly, handing him exactly what he needed before he even turned around. The room went silent for half a second. The resident blinked at her. "How did you know?" Claire adjusted the oxygen tubing without looking up. "His breathing changed 20 seconds ago." The resident frowned, embarrassed more than grateful. "Lucky guess." Claire said nothing. She simply stepped back out into the hallway. Across the ER, Daniel Mercer had stopped walking. He stood perfectly still beside the elevators, watching her from nearly 50 feet away. His expression never changed, yet something in his eyes sharpened slightly. Claire felt it immediately. The same feeling she used to get before incoming helicopters touched down in places nobody talked about anymore. Mercer finally spoke to the chief administrator beside him without taking his eyes off her. "Who's the new nurse?" The chief administrator glanced nervously at his tablet before answering. "Claire Whitmore. Transfer from Colorado." Daniel Mercer kept watching her across the emergency department while stretchers rolled past between them. "Experience?" he asked. "Mostly small hospitals, according to her file." Mercer narrowed his eyes slightly. "That is not how small hospital nurses move." Then he walked away without another word. Claire spent the next 2 hours barely speaking. She moved through the ER quietly, checking supply cabinets, replacing expired medication labels, correcting tubing setups nobody else noticed were wrong. Her hands never rushed. Never shook. During a trauma intake, she adjusted a patient's oxygen mask before the monitor alarm sounded. In room 6, she caught a dosage mistake seconds before medication reached the 4-line. A senior nurse named Patricia finally stopped beside her near the nurse's station. "You trying to make everybody else look bad?" Claire looked up calmly. No, ma'am. Patricia crossed her arms. Then slow down. People here do not like being corrected. Claire nodded once. Understood. But she did not actually slow down. Around lunchtime, cold rain hammered the hospital windows hard enough to rattle the glass. Ambulance sirens echoed faintly somewhere downtown. The ER remained packed. Patients lined the hallways waiting for beds while residents argued over scan results near radiology. Claire stood alone beside Trauma Bay 2, carefully reorganizing airway tools by size. A young surgeon walked by, glanced at her setup, then smirked. You know those do not need military inspection, right? Several interns laughed quietly behind him. Claire kept working. No, doctor, she answered softly. But when someone stops breathing, seconds matter. The surgeon rolled his eyes. Everybody wants to be a hero on their first week. Before Claire could respond, a sharp metallic crash exploded from down the hallway. A patient monitor dropped from its stand after a transport cart clipped the wires. The sudden noise startled nearly everyone nearby except Claire. She did not even flinch. The surgeon noticed immediately. His smile faded slightly. You military or something? Claire slid the final airway tube into place with precise alignment. No longer. Then she walked away before he could ask anything else. Inside room 9, an elderly man struggled to breathe while his daughter cried quietly beside the bed. A respiratory therapist adjusted settings twice without success. Claire entered silently, watching the patient for less than 5 seconds before stepping closer. Raise the bed 4 inches, she said gently. He is panicking because he feels trapped flat. The therapist hesitated. His chart says keep him low. Claire listened to the man's breathing again. He is fighting the pressure. Give him room. The therapist reluctantly adjusted the bed. Almost immediately the patient's breathing eased. His shoulders relaxed. The daughter looked stunned. How did you know that? Claire offered a small tired smile. People tell you things before they speak. Across the ER balcony overlooking the trauma floor, Daniel Mercer stood motionless beside the glass railing. He had watched the entire exchange without anyone noticing him there. Beside him, the chief administrator whispered carefully, "You think she is a problem?" Mercer stayed silent for several seconds. Down below, Claire cleaned the patient's bedside table while the older man finally breathed normally again. Mercer's eyes hardened slightly. "No," he said quietly. "I think she is hiding something." By 4:30 that afternoon, the storm outside had turned the entire city gray. Rainwater streaked across the emergency room windows while thunder rolled somewhere beyond downtown Chicago. Inside St. Vincent Memorial, the tension never eased. Stretchers filled nearly every hallway. Phones rang non-stop. Residents rushed between rooms carrying charts against their chests like shields. Claire Whitmore moved through the chaos with the same calm rhythm she had carried all day. She spoke softly. Walked steadily. Never wasted motion. Near the nurses' station, 2 interns whispered while watching her update medication logs by hand instead of using voice dictation software like everyone else. "She acts like she has done this in combat or something," one muttered quietly. The other smirked. "Or prison." Neither noticed Daniel Mercer standing at the far end of the corridor. He heard every word. His eyes shifted toward Claire again. Something about her bothered him now. Not because she was making mistakes. Because she was not. Nobody stayed that composed in a first-day emergency shift unless they had already survived worse places. A loud alarm suddenly echoed from Trauma Room 5. Nurses reacted instantly. A middle-aged man rushed in by ambulance after collapsing during a business conference downtown. Chest pain. Irregular breathing. Blood pressure unstable. The trauma team crowded around the bed while doctors fired rapid instructions across the room. Claire remained near the doorway listening carefully while attaching fresh 4 fluids beside another nurse. Possible cardiac event, one resident announced. Prep him for imaging. Claire looked up sharply. Something felt wrong. The patient's skin tone looked pale beneath the fluorescent lights. His breathing pattern staggered unevenly between shallow pulls. Most people would miss it in a crowded room. Claire did not. Her eyes dropped to his left hand resting near the blanket. 2 fingertips twitched slightly. Almost invisible. She stepped closer. Doctor, his abdomen is rigid. The resident barely glanced at her. We are focused on the heart right now. Claire kept watching the patient. His pressure is dropping too fast for that. Another doctor sighed impatiently. Nurse Whitmore, please stay in your lane. The room returned to controlled chaos. Monitors beeped harder now. Claire listened for 3 more seconds before moving beside the bed anyway. Her fingers pressed lightly near the patient's side. The man winced instantly despite barely being conscious. Claire's expression changed for the first time all day. Not fear. Recognition. Stop, she said quietly. Nobody listened. Stop now. This time her voice cut through the room sharp enough to silence everyone. Even the monitors suddenly felt quieter. The resident turned toward her angrily. Excuse me. Claire looked directly at him. He is bleeding internally. A few staff members exchanged uncomfortable looks. The resident scoffed. From what? You magically saw through skin. Claire ignored the comment completely. His pulse pressure is collapsing. Left side guarding. Cold extremities. He needs surgery before imaging. The resident shook his head. You do not make calls in my trauma room. Then another sound interrupted him. The patient's monitor suddenly dropped into warning range. Several nurses reacted at once. The resident froze briefly while checking the screen again. Blood pressure falling faster now. Claire stepped backward immediately, giving space without panic. 3 minutes, she said calmly. Maybe less. Across the room, the doors slid open. Daniel Mercer entered without warning, still wearing his dark overcoat from earlier. Rainwater dripped lightly from one shoulder. His sharp eyes scanned the room once before landing directly on Claire. What is going on here? Nobody answered immediately. The resident swallowed hard. Claire remained perfectly still beside the bed. Mercer noticed that too. Everyone else looked nervous. She looked prepared. Sir, the resident finally said, the new nurse. Thinks she diagnosed internal bleeding without imaging. Silence filled the trauma room. Mercer stared at Claire for several long seconds. Then he asked only one question. Why? Claire met his gaze evenly. Because I have seen this before. Daniel Mercer did not respond immediately. Rain tapped softly against the trauma room windows while the monitor continued its uneven warning tones behind him. The resident shifted nervously beside the bed. Sir, we should proceed with cardiac imaging before we lose more time. Mercer still watched Claire. You said you have seen this before, he said quietly. Where? Claire's eyes flicked toward the patient for less than a second. Places where waiting got people killed. The answer hung in the room heavier than anyone expected. Mercer noticed something then. She never tried to impress him. Never defended herself. She only watched the patient. The monitor dipped lower again. A nurse whispered under her breath, pressure is still dropping. Claire stepped closer to the bed without panic. His left abdomen is distended now. The resident finally snapped. Enough. You are a nurse, not a surgeon. Claire looked at him calmly. Then act like one. The room went dead silent. Even Mercer seemed surprised by the sudden steel in her voice. Before the resident could answer, the patient suddenly gasped sharply and grabbed weakly at the blanket near his stomach. The monitor alarm surged louder. Several staff members rushed forward at once. Mercer turned instantly toward the attending surgeon entering through the side doors. "Get him into surgery now." The resident blinked. "Sir, without imaging." Mercer's cold stare shut him down immediately. "Now." The entire trauma team exploded into motion. Wheels rattled across the floor. Surgical doors opened down the corridor. Claire stepped aside smoothly while nurses rushed the patient toward the operating wing. Mercer remained where he was for another second watching her. "My office," he said quietly. "After your shift." Then he walked out. Nobody in the room spoke for several moments after he left. Finally Patricia exhaled slowly beside the medication counter. "You have got guts, I will give you that." Claire picked up a discarded oxygen wrapper from the floor and tossed it into the trash. "I was not trying to challenge him." Patricia gave a short nervous laugh. "That makes it worse somehow." The emergency department barely had time to settle before the storm outside turned violent. Thunder shook the building hard enough to rattle ceiling panels. Ambulance radios crackled non-stop now. Downtown traffic accidents. Flooded intersections. Power failures spreading across several city blocks. Claire looked toward the ER entrance just as paramedics burst through the sliding doors with a soaked teenager on a stretcher. Then another stretcher appeared behind them. Then another. Water dripped across the floor beneath muddy boots while dispatch voices shouted through radios all at once. Multi-vehicle collision on Interstate 90. More incoming. The entire emergency room transformed instantly. Doctors moved faster. Nurses cleared beds. Trauma alarms echoed through every hallway. Somewhere nearby, a child started crying. Claire grabbed fresh gloves while Patricia hurried beside her. "Looks like the whole city is coming in tonight." Claire glanced toward the darkening windows. Her calm expression tightened slightly for the first time all day. Not fear. Recognition again. The same look someone gets when they hear distant thunder after surviving a storm once before. More sirens screamed outside. One ambulance after another pulled beneath the emergency entrance canopy. A paramedic rushed through the doors shouting, "Bus rollover. Multiple critical patients. We are overwhelmed out there." Across the ER balcony, Daniel Mercer reappeared above the trauma floor. He stared down at the growing chaos below while rain hammered the glass behind him like machine gun fire from another lifetime Claire clearly remembered too well. Then the hospital lights flickered once. Twice. Half the emergency department went dark for nearly 3 seconds before backup power kicked in. Several staff members froze. Claire did not. She was already moving toward the crash carts before anyone else realized what the next hour was about to become. Within 20 minutes, St. Vincent Memorial looked less like a hospital and more like a city under siege. Rainwater streaked across the automatic glass doors every few seconds as new ambulances arrived non-stop beneath flashing red lights. The waiting room overflowed with soaked families clutching blankets and paper cups of coffee nobody had time to drink. Trauma teams pushed stretchers down packed hallways while overhead speakers repeated emergency alerts in sharp mechanical tones. Somewhere near radiology, a transformer exploded outside with a muffled boom that rattled the ceiling vents. Half the lights dimmed again. Backup generators groaned to life seconds later. Daniel Mercer stood above the emergency floor with both hands gripping the balcony railing hard enough for his knuckles to pale. He had managed hospitals for 20 years. He had survived pandemics, lawsuits, disasters. Yet something about tonight felt different. More unstable. More dangerous. Below him, Claire Whitmore moved through the chaos without hesitation. She distributed oxygen tanks before respiratory staff asked for them. She redirected stretchers away from overloaded rooms seconds before bottlenecks formed. At one point she stopped beside a nervous young intern struggling to insert an 4-line into an elderly woman shaking from shock. "Slow your breathing first," Claire said softly. "Patients here panic even when you whisper." The intern stared at her for half a second before following her instructions. The 4 went in smoothly on the next attempt. Claire was already walking away before he managed to thank her. Another ambulance burst through the emergency entrance carrying a teenage boy unconscious beneath soaked thermal blankets. "Vehicle rollover," a paramedic shouted. "Possible chest trauma." Doctors crowded the stretcher immediately. Claire froze briefly beside the medication station the second she saw the boy's breathing pattern. Too shallow. Uneven pauses. Her eyes narrowed. "Get ultrasound ready now," she said quietly. One resident barely looked up. "We already have a trauma team." Claire did not argue. She simply grabbed the ultrasound machine herself and rolled it toward Trauma Bay 4. Across the room, Patricia noticed. "You ever stop moving?" she asked breathlessly while carrying blood bags toward surgery. Claire adjusted the machine settings with practiced precision. "Not when people still need help." Before Patricia could answer, another emergency call echoed from the ambulance radio near the entrance desk. "Incoming VIP patient. Male. 30 years old. Severe collapse during evacuation from downtown conference center." Several staff members immediately exchanged tense looks. Mercer looked down from the balcony sharply. He recognized the name the second the paramedic shouted it across the ER. Ethan Caldwell. Son of United States Senator Richard Caldwell. One of the hospital's largest political donors. The stretcher rolled through the doors seconds later surrounded by security personnel and paramedics drenched from the storm. Ethan's skin looked pale beneath the flashing lights overhead. His breathing came in weak strained pulls while monitors screamed unstable vitals beside him. Mercer moved downstairs immediately. Surgeons rushed into Trauma Bay 1 around the patient while administrators whispered anxiously nearby. "We cannot lose him," one surgeon muttered under his breath. Claire stood farther back near the supply cabinets watching quietly. Her expression shifted the moment Ethan grabbed weakly at his side beneath the blanket. A tiny movement. Almost nothing. Most people missed it completely. Claire did not. Internal pressure, she whispered to herself. The trauma team moved faster now. Orders collided through the room. Portable scans. Blood typing. Emergency prep. Yet the monitors kept dropping lower. One surgeon wiped sweat from his forehead. "Why is he crashing this fast?" Another shook his head. "Scans are not matching symptoms." Mercer stood at the foot of the bed trying to remain calm while the room around him slowly unraveled. Then Ethan suddenly struggled for breath hard enough to trigger another wave of alarm tones across every monitor in the room. Several doctors froze. One nurse backed away in panic. Claire stepped forward instantly. Not rushed. Not loud. Calm. Focused. The same expression someone carries when chaos stops feeling unfamiliar. Mercer looked up. Just in time to see her pull on fresh gloves while quietly saying the words nobody else in the room was ready to hear. "You are treating the wrong injury." The room fell silent for half a second after Claire spoke. Rain hammered the hospital windows hard enough to shake the glass while the monitors beside Ethan Caldwell screamed unstable rhythms into the chaos. One surgeon turned toward her immediately. "What did you just say?" Claire stepped closer to the bed, eyes fixed on Ethan's breathing. "His lungs are compensating for pressure loss. You are focused on chest trauma, but his abdomen is filling." The surgeon frowned. The scan did not show major bleeding. Claire reached for the portable ultrasound herself. "Because you scanned too high." Nobody moved. Nobody stopped her either. Daniel Mercer stood motionless near the foot of the bed watching every movement she made. Claire adjusted the probe with calm precision, sliding it lower across Ethan's side while the monitor tones climbed faster. Then she stopped. Her eyes narrowed slightly at the screen. "There," she said quietly. One of the residents stepped closer. His face drained of color almost instantly. Fluid buildup. Hidden internal bleeding. The trauma surgeon grabbed the screen next. "How did we miss that?" Claire never looked up. Because everyone was chasing the loudest injury. Mercer's jaw tightened slightly. Ethan's blood pressure dropped again. Another alarm erupted across the room. Several staff members began speaking at once. Surgery prep. Blood units. Operating room clearance. The tension became suffocating. Yet Claire's voice cut through all of it calmly. "Warm fluids first. Raise his left side 3 inches. Keep pressure off the lower cavity." The trauma surgeon blinked at her. "That is not standard protocol." Claire finally looked directly at him. "No, it is not." The surgeon hesitated only 1 second before following her instructions anyway. Around the room, people started moving faster now, but differently. More focused. Less panicked. Mercer noticed something that unsettled him deeply. Nobody questioned her twice anymore. Not after seeing the scan. Claire adjusted Ethan's oxygen mask while speaking softly enough that only the nearest staff could hear. "Stay with us, Ethan." Slow breaths. The young man's breathing steadied slightly despite the alarm still flashing overhead. A resident whispered under his breath, "Who trained this woman?" No one answered. Then the lights flickered again. Harder this time. Half the trauma bay dimmed into darkness before backup power surged back with a low mechanical hum. Somewhere in the hospital, people shouted. Another transformer failure outside. Rain continued pounding the city like an endless drumbeat. Mercer looked toward the ceiling briefly before turning back to Claire. "Can he survive surgery?" he asked. She paused for the first time since entering the room. Not uncertainty. Calculation. "If we move now." Mercer stared at her for one long second. Then he made a decision nobody expected. "Clear operating room 2 immediately," he ordered. "Whitmore goes with them." Several doctors looked shocked. One surgeon stepped forward quickly. "Sir, she is not authorized for trauma leadership." Mercer never raised his voice. "Neither are mistakes." Silence swallowed the room again. Claire did not react to the order emotionally. She simply secured Ethan's foreline while the surgical team rushed to prepare transport. As the bed rolled toward the operating wing, a paramedic standing near the doorway suddenly froze, staring at Claire's hands. Older man. Late 40s. Former military posture even beneath his soaked rain jacket. His eyes locked onto the way Claire wrapped pressure support around Ethan's side. Precise. Fast. Familiar. The paramedic took one slow step closer. "No way," he whispered under his breath. Claire glanced toward him briefly. Recognition flickered across her face like distant lightning. The man's expression changed instantly. Respect. Shock. Something deeper too. "Sergeant Whitmore?" he asked quietly. Several nearby nurses looked confused. Claire's eyes hardened slightly. Not anymore. But the paramedic could not stop staring. "I knew I recognized those hands," he said softly. "Fallujah Trauma Division. Ghost Raven Unit." The entire hallway outside operating room 2 went completely still. The hallway. Outside operating room 2 stayed silent long after the paramedic spoke the words Ghost Raven Unit. Rain hammered the rooftop above the surgical wing while emergency lights reflected red across the polished floor. Several nurses exchanged confused looks. One resident quietly whispered, "What is Ghost Raven?" Nobody answered immediately. The paramedic removed his soaked baseball cap slowly, still staring at Claire like he had just seen someone return from the dead. "You trained Marines outside Fallujah in 2007, he said softly. "You kept people alive when helicopters could not land." Claire adjusted Ethan Caldwell's oxygen line without looking at him. "That was a long time ago." The paramedic shook his head once. "Men in my unit still talk about you." Daniel Mercer stood near the operating room doors watching the entire exchange carefully. Every instinct told him this was bigger than military service. Bigger than a former combat medic quietly working trauma shifts in Chicago. Claire moved like someone who had lived inside chaos long enough to stop fearing it completely. Mercer had spent all day trying to understand why she unsettled him. Now he finally understood. She had seen places where hospitals were luxuries. One of the younger surgeons frowned. "Wait. Ghost Raven was not a medical unit." The paramedic glanced toward him. "No, it was not." His voice lowered slightly. "They attached medics because casualty rates were too high otherwise." The surgeon's face changed instantly. Claire finally looked up from Ethan's bedside. Her calm eyes hardened. "This patient needs surgery now." The spell broke immediately. Staff rushed back into motion around her. Surgical doors opened. Equipment rolled forward. Mercer stepped closer while the team prepared transport into Operating Room 2. "How many years were you deployed?" he asked quietly. Claire secured Ethan's blanket carefully before answering. "Enough." Mercer studied her face. No pride. No dramatic stories. Just exhaustion buried very deep beneath discipline. Before he could ask anything else, another trauma alert exploded across the hospital speakers. "Power failure on lower level 3. Backup. Systems unstable." The lights flickered again. Several people looked upward nervously. Claire did not even glance away from the patient. "Your generators are overloaded," she said calmly. Mercer frowned slightly. "How do you know that?" "Because the lights are cycling in 14-second intervals." The chief engineer standing nearby blinked in surprise. He checked his tablet instantly. "She is right." Mercer stared at Claire again. The unsettling feeling returned stronger now. Nothing about her reactions felt normal. Not for a nurse. Not even for a military medic. Ethan suddenly gasped weakly beneath the oxygen mask. The monitors dropped again. Claire immediately stepped beside him, speaking in a low steady voice. "Ethan, listen to me. You are going to hear a lot of noise. Stay with my voice." Somehow the young man's breathing steadied again despite the alarm surrounding him. The paramedic watched quietly from the hallway, then spoke one final time. "You know they said your entire team was gone." Claire paused for half a second. Just enough for something painful to flicker across her face before disappearing again. "They were," she answered softly. Silence followed her words. Heavy. Final. Even the storm outside suddenly sounded distant. Mercer felt something twist unexpectedly in his chest hearing the way she said it. Not like a soldier talking about history. Like someone still carrying every name. Operating Room 2 finally opened fully. Bright surgical lights spilled across the hallway floor. Claire pushed Ethan's stretcher forward without hesitation while surgeons followed behind her. Mercer stepped aside automatically as she passed. Then he noticed something small near the edge of her scrub sleeve. Faded lettering barely visible beneath the fabric where the stitching had worn thin over time. GR7. Mercer's eyes narrowed instantly. Military designation. Old. Nearly erased. Yet somehow still there. Claire disappeared into the operating room moments later while thunder shook the hospital again. Mercer remained standing alone in the hallway staring at the closed doors as one impossible thought settled heavily into his mind. The quiet nurse he almost dismissed on her first day might be the most experienced person in the entire building. Operating Room 2 stayed sealed for nearly 3 hours while the storm outside swallowed the city in darkness. Rain hammered the rooftop without stopping. Backup generators hummed through the walls in low, uneven vibrations that everyone inside the surgical wing could feel beneath their feet. Nurses moved quietly now. Even the loudest residents spoke in whispers whenever they passed the operating room doors. Something about Claire Whitmore had changed the atmosphere of the entire floor. Not because she demanded authority. Because she never did. Daniel Mercer remained in the hallway long after most administrators retreated upstairs. His overcoat rested folded across a nearby chair now. Tie loosened slightly. Exhaustion lined his face for the first time all day. Yet he never left. Every 20 minutes someone emerged from the operating room asking for additional supplies. More plasma. Different instruments. Warmer fluids. Each time the request came with the same strange sentence afterward. Claire said we need it now. Not Dr. Whitmore. Not Sergeant Whitmore. Just Claire. Somehow everyone inside had started listening to her without question. Patricia finally approached Mercer carrying a tray of untouched coffee cups from the waiting area. You should sit down, sir. Mercer barely looked away from the operating room doors. How long has she worked here? Today was her first shift. That answer settled heavily between them. Mercer exhaled slowly. No one learns instincts like that in civilian hospitals. Patricia hesitated briefly before speaking again. People trust her around patients. Mercer glanced toward her. Why? Patricia thought about it carefully. Because she never looks afraid. The word stayed with him long after Patricia walked away. Around midnight the storm knocked out another power grid somewhere downtown. Half the hospital dimmed sharply before emergency systems stabilized again. Alarms echoed briefly from lower levels. Several staff members flinched instinctively. Mercer noticed Claire exiting operating room 2 at that exact moment carrying blood-stained gloves toward disposal bins. She did not even glance upward at the flickering lights. Her body reacted differently. Not startled. Prepared. Like someone whose mind automatically measured exits, backup systems, failure points. Claire washed her hands carefully at the surgical sink while another surgeon followed behind her looking pale with exhaustion. I still do not understand how you recognize the bleed pattern that early, he admitted quietly. Claire dried her hands slowly. Because panic hides details. Where did you learn that? She paused for a second. Some places only give you one chance to notice mistakes. The surgeon studied her face. Ghost Raven was real, then. Claire looked down at the sink water swirling toward the drain. Very real. Before he could ask another question, the operating room doors opened again. Ethan Caldwell's surgeon stepped into the hallway removing his surgical cap with trembling relief. He is stable. The entire floor seemed to exhale at once. Nurses smiled weakly. Someone near the elevators quietly whispered thank God. Mercer closed his eyes briefly before walking toward the operating room doors. Good work, he told the surgical team. Then his eyes shifted toward Claire standing near the sink. All of you. Several doctors exchanged subtle looks hearing that. Daniel Mercer almost never offered praise. Claire simply nodded once. No smile. No pride. Mercer studied her for another long moment before speaking again, quieter this time. My office. Now. The storm still raged outside as they walked upstairs through dim emergency lighting. Neither spoke during the elevator ride. Mercer's office overlooked the flooded city streets below where ambulance lights reflected across rain-soaked intersections. Claire remained standing once inside while Mercer closed the door behind them. Silence stretched between them for several seconds. Finally Mercer asked the question he had been carrying all night. Why would someone with your background choose to disappear into a hospital ER? Claire looked toward the rain sliding down the glass windows. Her voice came softly. Tired. Honest. Because hospitals are quieter than war. Mercer said. Nothing. Claire's eyes lowered slightly. Most nights, anyway. Rain still covered Chicago when Claire Whitmore finally stepped out of Daniel Mercer's office sometime after 2 in the morning. The hospital had grown quieter now. Not calm. Just exhausted. Emergency generators hummed steadily through the walls while janitors pushed water buckets beneath leaking ceiling tiles in the older hallways. Most of the trauma patients from the interstate crash had stabilized. Others slept beneath dim recovery lights while nurses moved carefully between rooms speaking in low tired voices. Claire walked back toward the emergency department alone carrying a fresh cup of black coffee someone had left untouched near the nurses' station. Her steps remained steady even after nearly 18 straight hours awake. Across the ER floor, conversations slowly stopped as people noticed her returning. The atmosphere had changed completely since sunrise. Earlier that morning she had been invisible. Just another transfer nurse nobody planned to remember. Now residents straightened when she passed. Senior staff lowered their voices around her without understanding why. Respect had arrived quietly. The way it always does when fear finally leaves the room. Patricia looked up from patient charts near the desk. You know, half this hospital thinks you are some kind of classified government secret now. Claire gave the faintest tired smile. That sounds exhausting. Patricia studied her for a second. You really do not like attention, do you? Claire glanced toward the recovery wing where soft monitor tones echoed through the dim hallways. Attention usually comes after bad days. Before Patricia could respond, the elevator doors opened behind them. Daniel Mercer stepped into the ER without his overcoat for the first time all night. His sleeves were rolled slightly at the wrists now. Tie loosened. He looked older than he had 12 hours earlier. More human too. Several staff members immediately straightened instinctively when they saw him. Mercer ignored everyone at first. His eyes settled directly on Claire across the room. Then something happened nobody in the emergency department had ever seen before. Daniel Mercer walked to the center of the nurses' station and stopped. Listen carefully, he said calmly. Every conversation died instantly. Monitors beeped softly in distant rooms while rain tapped against the high windows overlooking the city. Mercer looked around at the exhausted staff surrounding him. Tonight this hospital stayed standing because people here refused to panic. His gaze shifted toward Claire. One person in particular reminded us what calm actually looks like. Complete silence filled the department. Several nurses stared openly now. Patricia nearly dropped her pen. Mercer had built a reputation across 3 states for being impossible to impress. Yet here he stood publicly acknowledging the quiet nurse he almost dismissed on her first day. Claire looked genuinely uncomfortable beneath the attention. Mercer noticed immediately. That almost made him respect her more. Ethan Caldwell is alive because Nurse Whitmore recognized what everyone else missed, he continued. Including me. The final words landed heavily across the room. Mercer never admitted mistakes. Not publicly. Not ever. Claire lowered her eyes briefly before speaking softly. The whole team saved him. Mercer shook his head once. No. The whole team followed you. Nobody spoke after that. They simply looked at her differently now. Not with fear. Not even admiration exactly. Something quieter. Deeper. The kind of respect earned only when competence speaks louder than titles ever could. Claire took a slow sip of now lukewarm coffee while the storm outside finally began to weaken. Somewhere down the hallway a patient laughed softly at something a nurse whispered. Another monitor settled into a steady rhythm. Life continued. Claire glanced toward the emergency entrance where dawn light barely started breaking through the rain clouds over Chicago. Then she quietly picked up a stack of fresh patient charts from the desk. "Room 12 still needs blood work," she said calmly before walking away. Around her, the entire emergency department moved again. But differently now. Nobody saw a rookie nurse anymore.